we're making it just very simple. Addiction by definition means can't stop. If you were outside the bar window looking in, trying to determine, hey, which one of those guys do I think is an alcoholic? You're going to have a real hard time. You're not going to be able to just pick them out because everybody in the room is getting drunk.
I have one friend in specific who always is asking that. What's the difference between addiction and someone that just became dependent on something or is going through a phase? Especially with all different sorts of pain medications, right? Because anyone can become dependent on that, right? That doesn't mean that it's addiction.
What intervention deals with is the fatal car crash crowd. That's who intervention is for. And if you treat the fatal car crash crowd like anybody in the dependent crowd, the approach is not going to work. Welcome to the Why Intervention Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Doyle, today joined by the one and only Danny Klein. Hello, Danny.
Christopher.
All right, man. Here we are. I haven't even told you what the topic is. This will be a flagship episode, I think. I feel real good about this one.
Excited. Well, I mean, coming off the back of the last one, I mean, that's tough to say.
Well, we'll see how this one compares. I don't know. But what I want to do, and the reason why I didn't want to tell you about the topic specifically is so that family members can see us kind of, blunder and stumble our way towards trying to explain this, just so that we can show how difficult it is for many people to describe this, to make this distinction. And the distinction is this. What we're going to talk about here topic-wise is what's the difference between dependence and addiction? What's the difference between dependence, addiction, a phase, and a bad habit? Okay?
And
we're going to look to do this across the board so that everybody is confident about what they're doing moving forward, so that we can once and for all address any sort of minimizations that families sometimes go through in saying they think it's just a phase, or he'll snap out of it. He's been using it a lot lately because of XYZ, stuff with his girlfriend, stuff at work, stuff here, stuff there. He's coping. He has some other mental health disorder that he's self-medicating for. He has all of these various different things. And what we want to do is get to a point where it's very clear whether you need to take action for addiction or not.
And this is actually a very big topic amongst my friends, like my friend group. And I'm not talking about like my friend group in recovery. I'm talking about like the group of kids that I grew up with that are, them knowing that I am in recovery and they're just interested and sometimes ask questions, right? I have one friend in specific who always is asking that. What's the difference between addiction and someone that just became dependent on something or is going through a phase? You know what I mean? Especially with all different sorts of pain medications, right? Because anyone can become dependent on that, right? That doesn't mean that it's addiction. So we'll get into it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't you take a stab at it? So when your friends ask you, how do you describe it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I could go all day, but in regards to, what's the difference between addiction and, say, dependence in that regard, right? I always use the pain medication as an example, right? And they're addictive by nature, meaning that anyone can you will become dependent on them. You will have to detox yourself off them. You will have to wean yourself off them, right? And then I always use the example of what makes myself, bodily different than the person that could just wean themselves off them and be okay, is me being like, I can't take 1, 2, 3 as prescribed, right? The second I take one, it's party over. Meaning my body is different than the person that is weaning themselves off, my friend, so to speak, right? Like, he just took one as prescribed. I'm sneaking in the bathroom for the rest of the night so they don't really see how many I'm taking because I can't stop.
Yeah. So what I love about this fact that the way that you just answered that, there was a clear distinction that I think most people would make the mistake of, and you didn't. So you didn't know what the topic was. You didn't know, and I was like, oh, I hope he doesn't say it. And you didn't. You said anybody can become dependent. And most people's language says anybody can become addicted to these. That's what people say. And that's not the truth. But anybody And if we say anybody, if we want to be that broad, we could say lots and lots of people can become dependent on using pain medication as the example. And we will. We'll use it multiple times in this episode to really make that distinction. But that's really, super duper that you nailed it right away, because had you said addiction, it would have been like, but you didn't.
We're gonna have to cut that. Right? We're gonna have to cut that. Yeah, but it's such a big talking point, and it's something that I discuss both inside and outside of recovery. A lot. It's a big talking point.
Yeah. So here's the challenge, though, with your explanation is that from a parent's perspective, right, or a family member's perspective, they don't see you in the bathroom. They don't see the difference between what your buddy was doing and what you were doing necessarily, especially if you're secretive, especially if you're really good at hiding it, right? And it's also not to say that your buddy, I'm sure there are some buddies who are dependent that look, pill for pill, close to you, maybe at least in the start, and I certainly know for me, alcohol being my primary, addiction, being an alcoholic, I could regularly be drunk under the table by people who were dependent on alcohol, who weren't alcoholics, right? Because they can drink. They've built up a tolerance to it. It's something that they do. And then, we're talking about dependent, we're talking about bad habit even, and for someone who then is, coping or using it just to, kind of for whatever reason, right? But compared to me, they're not alcoholics. And so how are we going to make that distinction from the family perspective? Because if you're looking at us just on quantities, I'm getting blown away, right? I look, like I'm a lightweight compared to, I would drink, when I was young, when I was 16, 17, I would drink a 6-pack and sometimes pass out because, I don't know. I don't really have an explanation for it other than to say, like sometimes I'd pass out. And I'd pass out maybe because I drank them too fast, like I just knocked them down in less than an hour, and I just overloaded my body. But I didn't do that all the time. But if all you were doing was looking at quantities, well, that wouldn't be a perfect indicator. It's alcoholism or dependence.
I always tell this story, and I think it's appropriate to tell it right now. I usually tell it to guys that I'm working with, talking to, kind of trying to explain addiction to, right? I had a buddy's house. We used to go to my friend's house every Thursday night, right? We'd go over there. I'm talking like I'm in my early 20s. This is before, I'm like right in early stages of addiction, I would say. And I'm in my early 20s, and there was, let's say 5 of us there, right? And this is around the time when pain medication was becoming very popular. No, it already was, right? It was exploding on the scene of really everybody was using pain medication recreationally, right? And so we're at my friend's house, right? And each one of us, would take one. We'd all take one, right? And we'd sit on the couch and we'd turn on whatever NBA game was on that night. We'd watch the basketball game and we'd sit there, we'd have fun, we'd joke, we'd laugh, right? And the other 4 people would just have that one in the beginning of the night, right? And this is the example that I said before, right? For the rest of the night, I would go into the bathroom and do another one, and then do another one. And then, and this is what I always try and say, right? The goal for that night for me was to be feeling good on that couch watching the game. That was the goal. What was always the end result was me nodding off, passed out, drooling on myself, and having my friends wake me up and say, hey, it's time to go home. Right? So I had no control. I couldn't control the quantity. You know what I mean? And let's look at that for a second. That's just a big, huge waste of money. Because I'm not feeling good. You know what I mean? I'm just slobbering on myself passed out. That wasn't the goal. I didn't want to get to that place, but I had no choice in the matter.
Yeah. There was a famous speaker, his name's Sandy, and he used to say, if we could just arrive and stay at the land of 3 drinks, we'd be okay, right? But that is what's impossible for an alcoholic or an addict. And someone who is dependent, I mean, look, if I give the simple 2-word definition for addiction, it's can't stop, okay? Can't stop. And so if we're making a distinction between someone with an addiction and someone who's dependent, the dependent person never loses the ability to stop during the course of their usage, okay? Now, this is, again, it's a challenging concept, right? And we are really going to dig into this, okay? But it's a challenging concept because oftentimes what you're using to judge it, again, is you're looking at the external circumstances at the time. You're looking at the situation. When I was in the firehouse, if we had, a boys' night out and 50 guys are going out to, the bar because we're, celebrating a guy's promotion or something like that, right?
Oh boy.
You're going to have something like 30 to 40 guys beyond buzzed or drunk, okay? 30 to 40. Let's say 35, okay? You're going to have a good 10 who consistently, at that party and every other party you've ever seen them at, they're going to be like, did they even drink? I don't know. I mean, I saw them with a beer. Now, by the way, I'm sober for my entire firefighting career. So every time I showed up at these events socially, which I, had to do, right? Reputationally, that's just what we do, is showing up at various different things. And so I'm at these events with good social cause for being there, right? And I get to be the observer, watching, all of this. And, sure enough, the same guys would show up who just, hardly drank. Just one or two, maybe. And what they can do is right in the middle of their second drink, they just stop. And for most people that are going to be listening to this podcast, that's going to be their experience. Their experience is, I could just have a glass of wine at dinner and not even finish it. And that's not unusual. That's the majority of people. That's their experience. And so you got 10. But now here's what I'm saying is that in that particular profession, there may be some more guys who are drawn to it because of, the adrenaline and the dopamine hits and everything that comes from, being a firefighter. But the point is that a lot of these guys are just tying one on for the night because it's a promotion. And they can do that. Then you're going to have your guys that consistently, and this is the ones that I marvel at. I just, it's unbelievable to me. It's impressive to me, is the guys that consistently, 100% of the time, are getting drunk, but once it hits 11 o'clock, they're looking and they're like, all right, take care, boys.
Yep.
And they're just out. And yeah, that guy is finishing his drink, but the point is, these people, regardless of how much they're drinking, and I'm not just talking about firefighters, not just people in general, regardless of the quantity, regardless of the amount, regardless of the, how inebriated they are, they never lose the ability to stop if they want to. There might be some challenge in stopping in the sense of quitting altogether, if for some reason that's called for, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in the moment, the fact is that they can stop in the middle of their 7th beer or their 11th beer. They can just shut it down, right? I mean, I knew a guy that would buy a 20 bag of cocaine and then do one line each nostril and then just decide, I'm not really into this. I got to get up early anyway, so I'm going to bed.
Save this for a rainy day.
Yeah, and save the rest of the cocaine, which is absolutely absurd to me, right? And then lastly, I should mention that at those parties, right, there's also consistently about 5 who clearly are struggling with alcoholism, right? And, I'm not drinking, but I'm one of the bunch. So I'm representative of alcoholism in the crowd, right? I just happen to be sober, right? So what's the point? The point is that statistically speaking, about 10% of us out of the 50 have alcoholism. Then there's this massive percentage that's just getting drunk, And then there's a smaller percentage, but a larger percentage who are dependent over the 10% of the alcoholics crowd. You follow what I'm saying? So there's more dependents than there are alcoholics. And there's more people just getting drunk. So what's the challenge? Again, if you were outside the bar window looking in, trying to determine, hey, which one of those guys do I think is an alcoholic? You're going to have a real hard time. You're not going to be able to just pick them out because everybody in the room is getting drunk, right? So what's very difficult, and so if we're making it just very simple, addiction by definition means can't stop. So I really want you to just hold on to that as we continue.
And I always think of this story. It kind of hits me like a ton of bricks because I remember it so clearly. To kind of bring it back to what I was talking about earlier on in the episode about the onslaught of pain medication, right, into my group of friends. And a buddy of mine, he said the word, what we've been talking about the whole time. He said dependence. He said it. Like, what turned into him taking one on a Thursday night, right? Then he would take one on a Saturday to get rid of a hangover, or he would take one on a Sunday to get ready for work on Monday, whatever it may be, right? Then all of a sudden it starts into he's taking one every day, right? And I remember we had a phone conversation, and he said this as clear as day. I got to put these things down because I'm becoming dependent on them. And that's exactly what he did. He put them away. Like, he did never touch them again. And I just remember, to me, when I was in the throes of this, I can't stop doing these things. You know what I mean? Like, I'm on the rise up at the time. You know what I mean? Meaning I am taking more and more, and it's what I think is my own little secret, but these guys all know, But what I'm trying to say is, like, he said that. I'm becoming dependent on these things. I need to put them down. And that was just so foreign to me, right? Because it was what I wanted to do so badly, but it wasn't even in my hemisphere. You know what I'm saying? That wasn't even an option.
Yeah. And that's very instructive, because if we're talking about, so dependence and alcoholism, or dependence and addiction, are essentially going to look identical. It's going to be very difficult to distinguish. If we're talking about dependence and a bad habit, well, when you start talking about a bad habit, now that's where we're saying the person is having some recognition, where they're saying, and so your buddy actually used the word dependence, which is probably a bit rare, right? So but the way that he would talk about it, or people would typically speak of it, is, I need to cut this out, I need to slow down. And now you're beginning to talk about a bad habit. So think about dependence and a bad habit as kind of being on the same spectrum, right? That you're essentially talking about the same thing. It's just about, like, how extreme, or how severe, how bad is it? Is it problematic? Is it, like, extensive? Who knows, right? But it's somewhere on the same scale, okay? I think one of the, I watched this documentary the other night. It's on Apple TV about Vietnam. And it reminded me of how, for this very topic, Johan Hari. I don't know what Johan's background is. He's written a couple of books, but he had a very successful, multiple millions of views TED Talk called Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, right? A bold title for a talk, right?
Yep.
And he makes a lot of great points. There's two things, though, that I take umbrage with, right? So he talks about the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And in that regard, he's got the solution pretty well nailed down, right? That's what the solution is going to look like. During his talk, he uses Vietnam as the example, though, to say that everything you think you know about addiction is wrong. And it kind of goes to what we've been saying here, where he's making the same point. But you're using your personal experience to make it.
Yeah.
He's saying that what most people believe is that if anybody uses heroin, you're going to be addicted to heroin, right? That's just what's going to happen. And then he gives the example of, but if he were to leave here and break his hip, and then the ambulance takes him, they're going to give him diamorphine, right away, right? I mean, today, they're going to give you fentanyl. In the ambulance ride on the way to the hospital, they're going to give you fentanyl in the hospital, right? That's so 95% of people, according to, statistic that he was drawing from, are not becoming dependent or addicted after they leave the hospital, right? I mean, this could really, blow your mind or confuse things or really, shake things up if you're a parent listening. But I had multiple knee surgeries and was prescribed painkillers for many of those knee surgeries. And now I was sober, and that might play into it, but, really I think that it's just chemically, it was a different thing for me than it was for you, Dan. In the same way that it's different for me when it comes to cocaine, it's different for me when it comes to alcohol. Those are things that as soon as I put any in my body, it is like there is no off switch. But when I took opiates in an attempt to get high with them, the very first time I used them, and I just it didn't really click with me. It's not like it's not like I didn't get buzzed from it. But eventually I just, went back to saying, okay, I'm just going to drink.
Going to do what I'm
going to do what I usually do.
Ground zero.
Because of what works for me, right? So even after being sober and having multiple knee surgeries and being prescribed opiates, I never took those opiates in any other way than as they were prescribed. And as soon as the prescription was finished, and sometimes in some of the surgeries, I didn't even finish the prescription. So here I am, the very person who was, giving that example of didn't even finish the glass of wine at dinner. I didn't even finish the opiate bottle. Once my knee felt good enough that I'm walking, I didn't even want to take them anymore, right? Because chemically, there's a difference here, right? So I wasn't even in the dependent crowd with a high-powered addictive substance.
I also feel like, though, if, play devil's advocate here a little bit, I would say that your recovery plays a part there somewhere.
Well, if a doctor prescribed me vodka for my knee, I'd be in trouble.
I don't think you'd take it.
Well, exactly. But I took the opiates as prescribed. So if a doctor were to say, if it was the 1920s, they'd be prescribing alcohol, to get through these things. But if I were to take that substance, I'm going to want more. It's just going to trigger that thing within me where now I can't stop, right? So Vietnam, as the example, is that you had these guys go to war, and while they were there, they became dependent on heroin. But Johann, in his talk, uses the word addicted. And so this is where you've got your whole title screw up, because you're saying everything you think you know about addiction is wrong. And it's like you don't have addiction down pat, because these guys came home and they were dependent. You can't use what's going on in Vietnam and observing what's happening there, the trauma and the devastation and all of the, just the bleak outlook and the desperation to get home. And then you get home and it's, a changed environment. And all these guys that were dependent, in the very same way, if you were looking in the bar window and say, well, which one of those guys is an addict, you're not going to be able to figure it out. So when you look at Vietnam, you go, oh, look, all these guys are addicted to heroin. But they weren't. They were dependent. And when you took them out of the environment and everything gets back to normal, 95% of them return to regular society and don't use heroin anymore with ease. They just let it go with ease.
Is that a real number?
That's what he quoted during the talk.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's all the evidence in the world right there. You're talking about the most addictive, right behind fentanyl, the most addictive substance in the whole world.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then he goes into Rat Park. Have you ever heard of Rat Park, the Rat Park studies? So similarly, it's if you take a rat and you have a rat that's addicted to alcohol and now or cocaine, and you have a choice between this water or cocaine water, and you have a rat in isolation, they're going to take the cocaine water and they're going to kill themselves.
Yeah.
They're going to kill themselves with the alcohol water. They're going to do it every time, right?
So I've seen that.
Yeah. So now he's making the connection between the Vietnam and the environment, and then making this thing that if you have Rat Park, where it's, yeah, of course, when it's bleak and you're isolated and you have regular water or you have cocaine water and there's no future here, there's nothing to play with, there's nobody around, what do? You just, drink this stuff until it kills you, right? But Rat Park is filled with all sorts of enjoyable things for the rats to do. There's so many rats, there's so much connection with other rats, and they don't choose the alcohol or the cocaine water anymore, right? And so now you have all these rat studies, and you go, oh, okay. Certainly this will translate to we're going to be curing alcoholism now, right? So there's this doctor, psychiatrist, his name is Marcus Helig. He worked in the NIH back in 2004, and this was back when like neuroscience was just like really like brain. They were making discoveries like every day that were just changing the way that they view everything, right? And so isolating the genes and the molecules and the brain, the neuroplasticity and all these various things, right? And they would make these discoveries, and then surely they're going to come up with a new treatment, and they did for alcohol or drug addiction, and clinically they would fail every single time. They just failed over and over again. It didn't do anything to help real-world alcoholics or addicts. They did study after study, and they'd show, and they'd go, oh my God, look at the brain region that lights up with this. Okay, we're going to treat it with this, and we're going to do that, and it didn't do anything. So this is an article, a landmark study on the origins of alcoholism. I think it was 2018 is when they published this. And so this guy, right, Dr. Marcus Helig, he goes back in time, right, and he looks at his studies, and he looks at everything, and he makes a realization. And so this is very profound in what we're talking about here, right? He says, anybody can get a rat addicted to alcohol. What's he really saying there? You can get a rat dependent on alcohol. You can get a rat dependent on cocaine. But that's not how actual society works. Because not everybody gets dependent, right? So when they started the study off by taking, say, 100 rats, and they'd put them all together, and then they'd go, okay, let's give them either a choice of water or alcohol water. Some of the rats would choose alcohol water. And then when they do Rat Park, those rats that initially chose the alcohol water, and then, not to say that the other rats didn't drink the alcohol water, but then they didn't do it ever again. You get what I'm saying? Whereas
Yes.
but there were some that did it just like all the other rats, but they stuck with it. And then when Rat Park becomes the option, and all these rats go running to Rat Park like this is going to be great, about 10% of the rats stuck with the alcohol water and would just stay there until they died. That is the can't stop feature of addiction. And that's the part of Johann's talk that he's missing, because it's not accurately describing the real problem that needs to be solved when you're talking about addiction, right? Because you're making the assumption that, oh, if I just move this person into a different environment and I give them all these tools and these resources and I get them around other people and their social, then that's going to be the connection that they need. And again, it's not to say that you're not right about the end goal of that as a solution, but how do you get them there? They're not willingly going on their own. They're not saying, they're looking over, the rats are looking over at Rat Park and saying, nah, I'm not going over there, right? I don't need to go do that. And so when you're dealing with addiction, you're dealing with people who are not interested in connecting in that way. Getting high, getting drunk is serving as the connection, is the solution internally for them. Obviously, it's a short-term solution. Obviously, it's not actually a solution, but it feels like it. It serves as that.
Yes. And, you know, what I think they're, you know, a huge difference. That's the part that people don't see. Right? Like, you're talking about looking at, you know, a half hour, you're talking about looking in the bar window. Mm-hmm. That's what we're not seeing there. The difference between dependence and actual addiction or alcoholism, right, is like the whys behind the stuff. You know what I mean? We're just seeing this big bar party and people drinking. There's a 10% crowd that there's a whole, you know, it will take us, you know, me and you could sit here and unpack all night and tomorrow about the reasons why they're drinking into oblivion. You know what I mean? But that's that 10%. And we can't see those whys are hidden. Those whys are, you know, buried in someone's stomach. You know what I mean? It's not, you can't tell, right? And over time, these things obviously start to show themselves. But it's not something that could be seen through a bar window. Right.
And so, you know, there was this guy, Dr. Carl Hart, and he wrote a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. Mm-hmm. And so he's making the case. He's a Columbia professor, and he's done numerous tests on all these various different substances. And, you know, and it's a fascinating book. It's an interesting read. And he's also very, you know, outspoken and public about how we need to, you know, get rid of the illegalization of, you know, substances. And he also discusses his own substance use and says that he regularly uses heroin. He'll use these, you know, cocaine. He'll use these substances, right? Now, I can't speak for his specific usage. I'm not here to talk about him specifically, right? What I want to talk about is the argument that he makes in his book. And if you read it, it's very fascinating. Here's one sentence, you know, to kind of describe the book, like basically the premise of the book. What he's saying is, imagine if the only subject of any discussion about driving automobiles was fatal car crashes. So our addiction discussion is about all of the major consequential, the DWIs and the, you know, like the things that are having the overdoses, right? And so from his standpoint, he's looking to make this argument that, you know, most people, as we've been saying here, are not going to become dependent on these very high-powered substances, right? Most people are not going to become addicted. It's a small percentage of the population, right?
Yes.
So in order for him to write the book, what he's saying is, I'm not discussing the ones that have the fatal car crashes. I want to discuss the 90% of people who are great drivers, who never get in any accidents. So if he can do that in order to make the premise for his book, well, then we can say, okay, our focus is the fatal car crash crowd. What intervention deals with is the fatal car crash crowd. That's who intervention is for. And if you treat the fatal car crash crowd like anybody in the dependent crowd, the approach is not going to work. And this is where, so from a societal perspective, where everything kind of gets confused and convoluted, is if you're dealing with a dependent person, and by and large, there are more dependents than there are addicts. Mm-hmm. A lot of the things that you think about when you talk about, you know, buck up, you know, pick up your bootstraps. What are you doing? What are you doing with your life, kiddo? Yeah. What's going on here? Like, why? How about let's get you a job, man. Let's get you a job. Or you need to get rid of this girl. You need to get rid of this kid, this guy. You know, like that. They're bad news. They're bad news in your life. You got to do something different. And if you're dealing with a dependent, that might work.
A pep talk it has a chance of working.
Yeah, especially if there's any kind of consequence around it, you know, like where if they've gone through something where they, you know, like something has just happened and it's, you know, listen, we're not doing this anymore. Like it's time for you to, you know, smarten up. You know, if you use language like that, most people that are dependent or less are going to potentially respond to that.
Yes.
And if you do that with someone who is an addict or an alcoholic, you will get nowhere. Mm-hmm. So indication number one that you're dealing with someone who has an addiction is, have you tried any of that? Because if you've tried that and they're still drinking or they're still using drugs, like that's indication number one that it's likely addiction. Now I'm going to give you something that's even more important to that. But before I do, I want to say, so how do you tell of a phase, right? Like, how do we know this is a phase? And, we just want to do this so quickly, just to get rid of this idea.
I just witnessed the phase. Like, I was in my life, a friend of mine.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Like, where broke up with his wife, that type of deal, where they got divorced. A lot of people thought it was alcoholism. I did not think it was alcoholism. He was really drinking himself into a very bad place, right? It was surrounded by a couple of people. It was addressed in a very serious way. He got back to working out. He got back to, putting his job first. And he got away from this phase, and everything in his life is just fine right now.
Yeah. So that borderline, phase into it's getting bad. Like, this is bad hat-forming thing that's going on.
It was everybody, his family, his close friends, everybody was very alarmed. The drinking was that serious. It was drinking in the morning, he was, and then we just literally had what you just said, basically, a serious pep talk. And he threw in some things such as working out and getting back into old routines and stuff like that. And it's like none of it ever happened. He's back. He's as good as new.
Okay. So now let's ask the question then. So why did you come to the determination that you didn't think it was alcoholism?
Because he's my age. I've known him my whole entire life. He's drank normally his whole entire life. You know what I mean? And I feel like I have enough experience to know the difference between someone who drinks normally and someone who, has addictive tendencies, so to speak.
Yeah.
And, knowing that he just went through this traumatic situation and he wasn't handling it well. And just, I feel like me having a front row seat to addiction on a daily basis, I have a little bit of an edge up on knowing the difference between what it is.
Perfect. So really what it comes down to is your experience with addiction. It's your experience to know that, this doesn't look like addiction to me, but to everybody else it did. Right?
Oh, they thought, it was like they were getting, let's get the beds ready, let's get a bed ready, the whole thing.
Yeah. Then highlight or emphasize this idea here, right? A phase is, so in that particular instance, it doesn't really apply because everybody we got to do something here. We got to help this guy. We got to, get him into rehab. That was what people were saying. Usually when a parent is saying it's just a phase, or a parent is talking to their brother or sister, right? It's like their kid's uncle, and it's, don't worry about it. It's just a phase. Like, all kids do this, right?
We hear that a lot.
Yeah. So here's the indication. Here's something that you need to be aware of as a parent. If you're saying that, you need to be concerned. If someone's saying it to you, you need to be concerned. Because when you think of a phase, I think of a phase, like my 5-year-old is pulling hair in preschool, or, you know what I mean? Like, that's a phase that a kid is going through, right? There's a natural tendency, of course, for teenagers to start experimenting with substances. That's going to happen, right? But not many of them are going to get jammed up in such a way that it's going to be public enough or elevated enough that it's going to get into your consciousness and the consciousness of other family members and people around you, where they're going to even be talking about it, to say that this is, don't worry about it, it's just a phase. To minimize it in that way. Just as a parent, take it seriously. If they're using substances and it's on your radar, and you want to say, well, it's probably just a phase, that is the indication that you might be moving toward, at the very least, you might be moving towards dependence, right? Which brings me to another great point that I'm happy I just, connected the dots there, because how do you deal with dependence? How do you deal with addiction? Well, if you don't go the pep talk route, because you know that's not what's going to work if you're dealing with addiction, but a pep talk kind of thing, or even a tough love kind of pep talk might work with someone who's dependent or someone that has a bad habit that's affecting other people around them. If you do what we coach parents to do, right, and coach families to do for addiction, but you were wrong and it was a dependent person, it's totally going to work for the dependent person too. You get what I'm saying?
Yep.
There's no downside to treating it like it's addiction and then finding out it's dependence. But if you treat it like they're just dependent, or it's a bad habit, or it's a phase and it's addiction, you're digging yourself a deeper hole.
Yes. And the reason why I kind of have this little smirk on the whole entire time as you're going through this is, and, you know, just we hear this a lot in regards to coming from a parent or maybe an aunt or an uncle, you know, they think it's a phase. And you can understand why, right? They're rooting for that. They want that so badly, right? Anything but full-fledged addiction, you know? Yeah. And you're almost like, you know, I don't want to use the word argue, right? But kind of talking to them in this way where you're trying to get them to understand some of the things that are going on in this situation, right? Because they want it so bad to be a phase or, you know, anything along those lines. They want it there. You could see it. Like, I'm picturing someone in my kitchen over there, right? And you can see them over there almost rooting, cheering, giving you all of their points to why they think it's a phase. You know what I mean? And they just want it so bad. That sometimes they want it so bad that it's clouding their judgment and they're not really seeing the full picture.
Yeah. And, of course, I totally empathize with that. And yes, that's why we're trying to, you know, make headway into this conversation so that, you know, we break down those myths and misconceptions, and that you understand that your kid, that you want it to be a phase. You want it to be a phase because you're terrified of what it might be if it is addiction and what that's going to take. And I totally understand that. You have every right to be afraid, because if it is addiction, you know, oh boy.
Sometimes it's not even terrified or afraid. Sometimes I've seen it before. I've seen embarrassment. Don't say that. Don't say that word. Yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, they don't want that attached, you know?
Of course, yeah. And let's not be that, let's not go to that extreme.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And why would you? Because if your picture of addiction in your mind is someone who is sleeping on the street and all that stuff, and, that's where, we're trying to make the point here. I got sober at 17. I was a full-blown alcoholic at 17. Mm-hmm. It had nothing to do with quantity. It had to do with the can't stop feature. Mm-hmm. That once I started, I can't stop, and every time I promised myself I wasn't going to do it anymore, there I would be doing it again.
Yeah.
So I was incapable of preventing myself. I was incapable of following through on promises I was making myself to me. Forget about anything I might have told anybody else, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's happening for me, and how many other people do we know that are sober in their late teens, right, who are, going to rehab or going to, 12-step recovery meetings or whatever it is, right, going to counseling, but it's already there. Mm-hmm. When you're thinking it's a phase, it may already be addiction. And you're going to have a really hard time distinguishing if what you're trying to do is just look at the usage and catch the usage and all of that kind of stuff, because you're never going to be able to assess it based on that alone. You just can't, right? So this came to me this week for the first time ever, and that's why I was like, this could be a flagship episode, because I've never heard anybody talk about this before. I've never heard, okay, so how do you really make the distinction? And you already alluded to it, right? Because you had that experience with this guy who's drinking and drinking a lot, but you just kind of intuitively knew, no, he's not an alcoholic. Somehow you knew it, right? And when I was working with the counseling unit internally inside the New York City Fire Department, anytime anybody would get jammed up, they would wind up, some kind of consequence from something, And it could be stress related. It could be, they didn't show up to work on time. It could be, domestic trouble at home. It could be, I'm on the verge of divorce. It could be just, post-traumatic stress from a really rough fire that they had been to. It could be job consequence, something where a boss is like, you need to go talk to somebody because of whatever it is that was happening in the firehouse. Or it could actually legitimately be substance related, like they got a DWI or they were arrested for something that was involving a bar fight or something, right? And now they're showing up and they're talking to me.
Yep.
I have more repetitions with this than your average bear. That's, hundreds of reps of sitting across from someone and talking to them and me doing an assessment and just kind of feeling them out and asking them questions and, seeing where they're at and where their answers are, right? And within 5 to 10 minutes, the guys that are alcoholics or addicts, I know it.
Yep.
And the guys that aren't, I know that too.
Yes.
So what's the key thing here? What's the thing that's like special about this? I don't know these guys at all. So for you, at least you knew this guy, like you knew his history, right? So what does it come down to? It's very simple. It's the way they talk about it. That's it. As you're asking them questions, and now I basically have a captive audience. They know that they have to sit here for at least 45 minutes talking to this guy. They don't know me, right? But they just got in trouble, or their captain just sent them there. So they're beholden to speaking with me, right? And so because of that, they got to answer my questions, and the way that they talk about whatever it is that's happened, and when I ask them about their history and their drinking, their drug use, what's happened, for someone who is dependent or doesn't have a problem, they are, in some kind of way, they're just transparent. They talk about it in a way where it's not elusive, right? So liken it to, say, someone who, has like weight issues, right? Somebody that's struggling with losing weight. Let's take someone that's, a guy that's 80 pounds overweight, okay? And if you talk to him, and so how's the gym going? And he'll go, it's tough, man. I'm not doing as good as I want. I dropped 10 pounds like in the year, and then I just went back to eating ice cream, and now I'm back to, so I'm trying to get back into it. But man, it's hard. And they're able to talk about the struggle with it in a way that's kind of open and transparent, versus someone who, now this is where the kind of metaphor might drop off, right? But imagine someone that's 80 pounds overweight and you're talking to them about going to the gym and they're like, no, I'm fine. No, what do you, like you wouldn't even see that necessarily with someone who's, overweight. Maybe, like in some cases, in small numbers of cases where it's just, I talk to him like he's got to cut out McDonald's, but he just goes all the time, right? Maybe that person is really struggling with their almost like an addictive relationship with the food that they're eating, and they're not, they're just not going to the gym. They're not taking care of themselves in that way. But if you were to talk to that person, right? And so this is kind of like the silly example here, but imagine that guy who's 80 pounds overweight and is, the equivalent of someone with an addiction. They're talking to the doctor. And the doctor is, so, when you came in here, you said you're 6 foot. Okay, 6 foot. And I look at this thing here. It says 200 is the healthy weight. And when you got on the scale, it's 280. How do you feel about that? I said, no, I'm fine. I feel good. Doc. Well, why don't we put you on this regimen where it's, no, I don't really think I need to do anything. Like, why would I do that? I said, well, because, again, the scale showed 280 and the healthy weight for a guy your size, and this is 200. But everybody's different, right? So there's this like back and forth, there's this pushback, and they're either going to get defensive and they're just going to lie, and they're just be like, what are you even talking about? Or they're going to yes you. They're going to tell you whatever it is that they think you want to hear. It's, yeah, okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm going to go to the gym. I'll go to the gym and I'll do this. I'll change my diet and I'll do that. I'll start eating broccoli. And the doctor's, oh, okay. And then as soon as they leave the office, in their head, they're going, that guy's such a jerk. I'm never going to this guy ever again.
Never eating broccoli.
And that's it, right?
Yeah.
And they're never going to go to that doctor ever again. So it's not, obviously, that example isn't like a direct equivalency, but whenever I would talk to someone who was addicted, it's defensive. It's justifying. It's 3 times the explanation. It's the rationalization. It's the inability to connect the dots between the circumstances of their life and the substance use. In other instances, where a guy would get arrested for a DWI, and I'd be talking to them, and I'm talking about their early history, and they would just be upfront and forward and just be like, yeah, I mean, I used to drink. I started drinking when I was 15. I, didn't really get into it. I smoked some weed here and there. The other guys, it'd be like, you ever smoke weed? Nah. And then 15 minutes later, I'd get them into a corner where they'd be like, oh, I mean, yeah, I smoked weed here, you know what I mean? And then that's when you start to see it. So you're not going to be able to tell it from what you're observing necessarily, but you can tell it from what they're communicating, from how they're talking about it, which requires you as parents to talk about it. That's the initial stage here, especially if you're a parent to a teen. You got to start having the conversations about substance use early and start to put them in situations or at least get some agreements from them. So the easiest thing, like number one strategy, go to whyintervention.com and I have this all laid out here for you. You can go get it, and I think it's free right now. You can go through this whole thing. It's like a little mini course and all these various different guides. I call it the Can't Stop Guide. And then I had the 3 mistakes you make when you first discover your child using substances. You go through all that, you're going to find out that the approach needs to be, what you need to be able to communicate what your expectations are around their substance use. And begin to set out, I would really prefer that you not use substances, at the very least, as a baseline. Establishing the position that I would really prefer that you not use substances for X, Y, Z reasons, right? And we go over all the reasons, so that you can make it particular to you and your circumstances with your child. Ideally, you could even say, under no circumstances are we okay with you drinking or using drugs at all until you're 21, right? And you can talk about brain health and just, your brain isn't even fully developed until you're 25. So we'd really appreciate, no drinking, no drug use until you're 25. And that would just be crazy. You wouldn't expect that they're actually not going to. They're gonna. But because you're having the conversation, you get to have another conversation, and that's when you get to start to hear how they talk about it.
Yeah. Great
and that is really the critical thing that you need to start to implement as a parent, because it's really the only indication that you're going to have. And, what I was going to say before, from a parenting perspective, it's like you have parents grossly underestimate the amount of pain and suffering and torment that we as people with addictions are able to tolerate, because we have short-term relief in the substance that we're using.
Yes.
So we're getting little pops of relief, and we're going to it all the time. And that relief is so good. We're not talking like a little pittance of relief. We're talking about I take this substance and I feel like everything is okay.
Cured.
Everything is so okay, right? And so we can go on for a long time. And if you happen to have a child who's addicted and can't stop, then that can go on for years and years. And when you're talking alcohol or weed, you're talking decades. And you hoping that they're going to stop, or again, like your pep talk maybe is going to get them to because you think that it's like a bad habit that they can just shift. But if they're addicted to it, it can go on for decades. And if it's crystal meth, if it's heroin, if it's fentanyl, it ends a lot sooner, But it doesn't end because they're getting help. It ends that they get stopped, be by an overdose or getting locked up or something like that. And that's not a great outcome, And it also is worth saying that we also underestimate what it takes to recover as far as just length of time. So the sooner that you start, the better, right? So if you think about this idea of can't stop, it's imagine all of the trains leaving the station and there's just a couple of them that don't have brakes. They're all getting going at the same time. They're all just getting started. There's a big adventure ahead, a lot of track to run, you know what I mean? And it's just going to be a fun time. And there's no reason to stop because we're just getting going. We're just building momentum. All the trains are leaving the station and they're all going on this adventure. But the ones that don't have brakes aren't going to find out because there's no reason to pump the brakes right now. There's just no reason to stop. There's no reason to test what stopping is like. And so that's what the normal experimenting is like for like teenagers in any kind of substances. And you think, okay, my kid's responsible and he's smart and he knows better. Yeah, and they're all, like all of those kids are. And they're all on the train. And you go, well, my kid is not going to be so dumb as to, just like start careening down a curve at high speed, like they're going to slow down. And they likely will. But not the ones that don't have brakes. So they can be as smart as you want. And you can use as much tough love as you want. You got to stop. How could you not? They can't. Or you can use as much positive reinforcement and love and connection talk as you want.
And then, you're talking about like the teenage phase, right? And then as you start to get older, I'm thinking in my head right now, right into that, past the teenage, into the 20-year, into that 20 to 25-ish range or even a little older, right? Now we start to play the Groundhog Day game, the tomorrow game, right? Like why me and you or you and I are so necessary. Why intervention is so necessary. Because if you're addicted to a substance, you're going to stop tomorrow. And then you're going to stop tomorrow. And then you're going to stop. And that goes on for, like you said, it's wild, the persistence that someone that is addicted could have. You know what I'm saying? That bounce back, the way they could just eat it and keep going because they have these pockets of feeling amazing. But, once you get into that place of, you call it Groundhog Day. Once you get into that place of tomorrow, where you're going to stop tomorrow, you have to be intervened on. Because I know people that I've personally have done that for over a year. Played that same game of, I'm going to stop tomorrow. Over 365 tomorrows.
Wow. And any one of those days could have been your last.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is what's really tough, is that somehow, and I, alluded to the strategy. It's my number one strategy that I give to parents that I work with. And now I want to just give it away, right? So I want you to visit whyintervention.com and get access to it and get the mini course there and all the free resources that I have around this. Because if your child is on a train that doesn't have any brakes, this is where it gets really confusing because they're going to say stuff like, I can stop whenever I want to. Or, I got it under control. Don't worry about me. I'm good. It's fine. And again, to all appearances, if you're just looking at the train rumbling down the tracks, it's okay. Everything looks fine right now. But it's going to go through a narrow mountainous terrain at some point. You know what I mean? Or like the old movies where it's like the track is out up ahead, and there's like a cliff. So they're hurtling towards this, and all the while, they don't know that they can't stop. That is the key feature of addiction.
Yeah.
The key feature of addiction is they really think that when push comes to shove, they're just going to shut it down when they're ready.
I can't stress this enough when I talked about those 306. This might sound ridiculous. I planned for tomorrow as if I was really stopping tomorrow. And I did that right now I'm paraphrasing, but I did that 365 times in a row. Like dead serious stopping tomorrow. And now I'm making plans. Okay, things are going to be okay in a week because I'm stopping tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I don't want to be, I'm really not trying to be a jerk about this, but I just feel like it needs to be said. It needs to just be like very plain spoken in the sense of you have lots of programs and group therapies and group counseling and various different approaches that people are recommending family members go to, right? And yeah, going back to the 80s, it would have been tough love as an approach. And then today, it'll be more about like positive reinforcement as an approach. You even have some people kind of swinging back, Oh, I'm reminded of the other thing I take umbrage with when it comes to Johann Hari's talk. During his TED Talk, he says, I can understand why if the opposite of addiction is connection, and so people with addictions, they need connection in order to recover. And then I can understand why an intervention doesn't work, because then the family gathers together, and what they do is that they threaten the connection unless they go and they do something. And as I'm listening to that, I'm just thinking, well, Johann, what makes you think it's unsuccessful? The 90% success rate of interventions when you do them properly? It's better than a 90% success rate. So it's not about threatening the connection. What we talk about, you can remain as connected as possible, but what you're going to say is, I love you, I care about you, but my focus is going to be, we need to help you stop the train. Here's what we are willing to do to get the train to stop and to get you off the train, and that's it. That needs to be our singular focus, because we now understand that the train doesn't have any brakes. It's out of control, right? So you can do all the positive reinforcing you want to try and connect with them and to love them with all your heart and to say, honey, don't you think that it's a good time now to stop or to slow down? They can't. They can't stop. There's no brakes. So whether you're on one extreme or the other as far as your approach goes, it's an impossibility for the train to stop without the brakes, right? So once you recognize that and you adopt that as, okay, so this is the principle that we're going to be operating with. So our singular focus is we got to help them stop. That's it, because they can't stop on their own. So we got to help them stop. And once you get hyper-focused on, so the outcome we're after is help them stop at all costs. So what does that look like strategy-wise? What do we have to do in order to accomplish that goal, right? And that's what we do. That's what we coach families to do, and we get them to stop all the time.
And I feel like once, you really honed in on this, but once you shift your focus to that area, you know what I mean? Once you shift your focus to, all right, once you come to that realization that they can't stop, we need to help them stop. I mean, you've already won like half the battle right there, right? Think of all the, all the stuff you were fighting for so long. You can now just throw to the side. Here we have a singular focus, and now we're ready to go.
Yeah. Probably more than half. I mean, you're really like 80-90% of the way there. Because it's now you're not gonna waste time and money and energy doing a whole bunch of stuff that's never going to work because you've misdiagnosed the problem.
I'm thinking energy and time.
Yeah.
The amount of energy that I watch people just scatterbrain thoughts, you know what I mean? Just trying to figure stuff out, this, that, monitoring, doing this, doing that. And it's your heart breaks for them because you're watching someone literally just melt down in front of you.
Right. So, in closing, highlights of this episode here, right? How do you tell? It's in the way that they talk. That's really the key thing, right? And connection is going to be the solution. It's just that you got to have an accurate read on what the actual problem is, and the actual problem is that if you're dealing with addiction, they can't stop. And if you deal with it like they can't stop and it winds up, they had brakes. Guess what's going to happen? The ones that have brakes, they're going to pump the brakes.
Yep.
So, once you get talking to them in this way, they're going to pump the brakes. And then they're going to slow down and you're going to get what you want. The ones who don't have breaks desperately need you to adopt the tools, the skill set of intervention. And that's what we're all about. Visit whyintervention.com, make use of all of the free resources we have. I really want this for you as parents, because it breaks my heart to have to get phone calls from people who are, obviously anybody that's losing children is devastating. But the next devastating thing is to hear somebody who's in their 50s or in their 60s and you're looking to intervene on them now. And it's, as soon as I start to get their history, it's like, this has been evident for 45 years.
Yep.
And had the people around this individual known that there's no brakes on this train and that we got to help it stop, we could have dealt with this a lot sooner. And now that he's in his 50s or 60s, it's so much harder to get this barreling train to, it's seconds away from the cliff, basically. It's like really challenging, really extreme, a lot harder to do. I'm not saying it's impossible. There's always hope, and I've intervened on people that, in their 60s that were retired, and we've got them into rehab, but it's just a lot different.
Definitely harder.
A lot different than getting a 17, 18, 19, 20, even a 30-year-old into treatment. So I just really want to...
Tough teaching an old dog new tricks. I'm being dead serious with that.
Yeah. And they're so ingrained, and they've lived a life. They got security. They have, they're likely divorced. The kids are all grown. And everybody is likely given up. It's a very apathetic feel, like there isn't a lot of hope, and so it takes a lot to get everybody motivated to even do what's required to make the changes to get this train to stop, So, it's just kind of like a passion for us to get to this early, to stop addiction early. Part of the free resources, I wrote a book. It's available for free right now if you get on our email list. So visit whyintervention.com. You'll get all that stuff. Thank you for listening, Dan. Excellent episode. Hopefully we help a lot of people with this one.
That's 2 really great topics in a row. I'm looking forward to what's next.
Yeah. All right. See you in the next episode. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.